Good morning. This is Brother Aaron, and this is January 21st, and this is your world history class. And we are going to continue our study in chapter 15 in the post-Reformation Europe. Turn with me, if you would, to page 212, and we're going to study about the Reformation in France. The Huguenots, the French monarchy. By the beginning of the Reformation, France was a strong nation state with an unrestricted monarchy. The French people had no established rights, and French kings had tremendous power over the government, the economy, and even the church. As the modern age began, there seemed to be no obstacles to the growing power of the French monarchy. With regard to the Reformation, the power of the king over religion in France was particularly important. French kings had never been as strongly controlled by medieval popes as other European monarchs had been. On the contrary, the French king had such power over the Roman Church in France that he was practically a national pope. Church and state had become so closely tied together in France, and religion had been viewed from a political vantage point for so long that any change in religion foreshadowed a change in politics as well. In spite of Protestant declarations that the Reformation was not a political revolution, nor were the Protestant rebels, the French monarchy viewed any break with the church as a threat to its own power and authority. The French king had political motives for rejecting the Reformation, but many French people welcomed it. Protestant leader John Calvin remained in France until 1534, when he was forced to flee from persecution. Calvin's Institutes, though originally published in Latin, was very early translated into French. A large number of Frenchmen were influenced by Calvin's teachings, and many became Huguenots, French Calvinist Protestants, and left the Church of Rome. In spite of increasing political hostility toward them, the number of Huguenots continued to increase until they became an important minority. Huguenots came from all classes, from peasants to lords, but Protestantism was especially strong in the noble class. By the mid-1500s, nearly half of the nobles in France had become Protestants. From its very beginning, the Protestant movement in France was suppressed by the kings. Both Francis I and Henry II took actions against the Huguenots, forcing them to meet and worship in secret. By the 1550s, the prisons were filled with Huguenots, but as persecution intensified, the Huguenots increased in number. In some areas, the Huguenots grew so rapidly they soon took over old Roman church buildings and used them for public worship. In 1559, French Protestants met in their first synod and Assembly of Representatives and drew up a confession of faith and rules of discipline. They also composed an address to the king asking for official permission to hold meetings for public worship. The Huguenots assembled very carefully, pledged loyalty to the king, and raised no purely political points. However, the very fact that the Protestants were organized in an assembly was taken as a threat by the king. In 1559, the year of the Huguenot Synod, King Henry II was mortally wounded in a jousting tournament. The king left three sons, each of whom served as king during the course of the next 30 years: Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. During this 30-year period, the mother of these kings, Catherine de' Medici, attempted to rule for her young sons. She proved ruthless and unscrupulous in her scheming to control the country for her own selfish interest. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, factions tried to control these weak kings and their powerful mother. The two chief rival factions that tried to control the monarchy identified themselves with the basic religious divisions in France, Catholics and Protestants. In the last 4 decades of the 16th century, 9 civil wars were fought in France, all in the name of religion. The Protestants were led by such men as Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, who had previously won fame as a military leader, and Henry of Navarre, the ruler of a small independent kingdom in the area of the Pyrenees Mountains between Spain and France. The Catholic forces were led by the prominent Guise family. Catherine of de' Medici was more or less caught in the middle. Realizing that both Catholics and Protestants desired to supplant her power, she shrewdly calculated her defense and tried to play one side against the other. Because Catherine feared the Protestants more than she feared the Catholics, she contrived a feeble, futile effort at peace in January 1562. The so-called Edict of January decreed that Huguenots could worship in public if they met outside the town limits, and if they admitted royal officials to inspect their services. Like later attempts at toleration in France, this had one tragic flaw. It was not based on the acceptance of toleration as a matter of principle, but as a matter of convenience. What is convenient, however, can change from one moment to the next, as Huguenots would soon discover. Beginning in 1562, more than 30 years of religious war tore France to pieces. These were not civil wars of the kind where one region of the country takes up arms against another, each retaining some apparatus of government, as in the American Civil War or the civil wars of the 17th century in England. They were civil wars of the kind fought in the absence of government. Roving bands of armed men without territorial base or regular means of subsistence wandered about the country, fighting and plundering and joining and separating from other similar bands and shifting hosts that were quickly formed or quickly dissolved. It just was chaos is what it was. The wars wreaked havoc on the countryside and in the towns, inflicting massive damage, destruction of property, and claiming many lives. Neither side was able to subdue the other completely, and many temporary truces were negotiated. During one of these unstable truces in 1572, the most infamous episode of the French religious wars occurred. St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Hundreds of Huguenots had gathered in Paris to attend the marriage of Henry of Navarre, one of Protestant leaders, to the king's sister. After convincing her son, Charles IX, that the Protestant leader, Admiral Coligny, was plotting against him, Catherine initiated one of the most brutal acts in history. On dawn of August 24th, 1572, Catholic forces attacked their Protestant rivals while they were still in their beds. The violence lasted for 3 days. It started in Paris, where nearly all Huguenots were killed. Admiral Coligny was one of the first murdered. Henry of Navarre escaped death only by vowing to change his religion. The massacre spread from Paris throughout France. Perhaps as many as 100,000 Huguenots were murdered. In Rome, a medal was struck to commemorate the massacre, and the rousing songs of thanksgiving were sung. Both Pope Gregory XIII and Philip II of Spain praised the King of France and expressed the hope that the massacre was the beginning of a final solution to the Protestant problem. The massacre, however, only aroused the surviving Huguenots to furious resistance, and the warring resumed. In 1589, King Henry III and Henry of Guise, a Catholic leader who had both been trying to dethrone the king, were both assassinated, and Catherine of Domitius died. But by the rules of succession, the crown passed to Henry of Navarre, who became Henry VI, the first of the Bourbon line of French kings and the first Protestant king of France. Henry faced a great dilemma. During the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, he had been confronted by the French king with the choice of renunciation of Protestantism or immediate death, whereupon Henry had declared himself a Catholic. Shortly after the renunciation, Henry had become an avowed Protestant again. But the majority of Frenchmen were still Catholics, and the leaders of the Catholic forces in France refused to accept Henry as a Protestant king. It seemed that bloodshed over religion would continue even after Henry's coronation as King of France. The people of Paris would not admit him to his own capital city. Stay with me, Danny. Henry's closest advisor counseled him to change his religion again and declare himself a Catholic for the good of France. Henry IV officially renounced Protestantism on July 25th, 1593. Pondering that as a Protestant he could not enter the city of his throne, Henry is said to have concluded, Paris is worth a mass. His professed conversion effectively ended the religious wars in France. Outraged with Henry's latest change of religion, the Huguenots perceived their new king to be a traitor. But in 1598, Henry eased their displeasure with the Edict of Nantes, which stipulated that Huguenots could live in any towns or districts of France they chose, but could practice their faith only in specifically designated towns where Protestantism had previously been the prevailing religion. Huguenots were forbidden to practice or teach their religion outside the designated territories. Specifically forbidden was the practice of Huguenot religion at the king's court or anywhere in Paris or in a surrounding city. On the other hand, Huguenots were not to be discriminated against in admission to colleges and universities, uses of public health facilities, or holding public office. For their protection, the edict also gave the Huguenots 100 fortified towns to be held by Protestant military garrisons. The edict eased tensions for the moment. The Huguenots basically wanted toleration and seemed to be satisfied with the edict. Like earlier efforts at limited toleration in France, and much like the Peace of Augsburg in Germany in 1555, the Edict of Nantes followed the principle of territorial toleration, allowing the Huguenots freedom of worship only in certain territories. Thus, the edict was in reality only a political compromise. It was shortly proved to be unworkable and would lead to no more religious problems in France. Huguenots in jeopardy. When Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, his second wife, Marie de Médicis, attempted to rule in his stead. The clergy forced her to call the Estates General, the representative assembly of France, but there were so many conflicting interests in the assembly that she soon dismissed it. The Estates General would not be called again for nearly 180 years. The control of the government gradually fell into the hands of Cardinal Richelieu, who ruled from Marie de Médicis and her young son, King Louis XIII. Cardinal Richelieu worked tirelessly and ruthlessly for his own political advancement and for the increased power of the monarchy. As France moved closer and closer to the political absolutism, the limited religious liberty established by the Edict of Nantes was slowly chipped away. Richelieu seemed content to leave the Huguenots alone until some of them showed signs of trying to regain political power in France. When he took steps to subdue their action, they rebelled. Richelieu crushed the rebellion and then amended the Edict of Nantes with the Peace of Alais of 1629. For the moment, the Huguenots retained their civil and religious liberties, but they lost their fortified towns and armies and were now in constant peril of losing all of their freedoms. Page 215. A temporary truce. The Peace of Augsburg fails. In 60 years following the Peace of Augsburg, a shaky truce was observed by the princes of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. The treaty was supposed to stabilize politics and religion in Germany by combining the two. Put your phone down, Jay. But the Peace of Augsburg proved to be only a temporary truce. The Reformation had set loose forces that no treaty could control, as the political and religious situation changed constantly. As more territories formerly controlled by Roman officials became Lutheran, the balance between the Lutherans and Catholics was upset. In fact, by 1600, 9/10 of the population of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as a significant majority of German princes, professed to be Protestant. As further disturbance, Calvinism, although it had been excluded by the Peace of Augsburg, spread into Germany. Led by Calvinist prince and Protestant states of Germany formed a league in 1608 and prepared to fight if necessary. Germany's Catholic states, strengthened by the Counter-Reformation, responded with a league of their own the following year. As they prepared for war, each side appealed to foreign powers for help. What followed was one of the most confusing and disastrous wars in history of Europe. The 30 Years' Wars, which occurred in phases between 1618 and 1648, was mainly a civil war in Germany and Holy Roman Empire over internal religious political issues. But many European countries, including Spain, Austria, France, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and England, also became involved. The 30 Years' War began in Bohemia in 1618, 100 years after the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Bohemia had experienced its own Reformation under the great Christian martyr John Huss. More than a century before the Protestant Reformation. By the 1500s, most Bohemians were members of Hussite churches. Through the following century, the Hussite Bohemians were successfully defended themselves in wars against popes, emperors, and kings who wanted to put them back under Roman control. In 1618, new hostilities began when a Roman archbishop ordered an end to the Protestant church services in Bohemia. The Bohemian Protestants revolted and deposed the Bohemian king Ferdinand II, a member of the powerful Habsburg royal family, an ardent Romanist in favor of Protestant noble. But in 1619, Ferdinand II became the Holy Roman Emperor, determined to return Bohemia to Romanism by force if necessary. By 1621, with the aid of mercenaries from Spain, Ferdinand's generals had crushed Protestant resistance, and Ferdinand began to wipe out political and religious liberty in Bohemia. The conflict soon spread to other parts of the Holy Roman Empire as the Protestant princes recognized the danger to their own homelands. In desperation, German Protestants asked Christian IV, the Lutheran king of Denmark, for assistance. In 1625, with their support of England and the Netherlands, Christian invaded Germany as the champion of Lutheran Protestantism. But the Danes suffered several crushing defeats at the hands of Count Tilly and Albrecht Wallenstein, Ferdinand's best generals. In 1629, Denmark had been forced out of the war. It seems as if Protestantism were on the verge of collapse in Germany, and that Romanism would again become the established religion of the empire. Then Gustav Adolphus of Sweden, a great Lutheran warrior king, landed in Germany with a well-trained army. With his brilliant leadership, Gustavus turned the tide of the war, decisively defeating General Tilly's army in 1631. For a time, the Protestant forces had the upper hand. However, when the Swedes defeated Wallenstein's mercenaries at the Battle of Lutzen, Gustavus was killed, dashing the Swedish hopes of a Protestant confederation in Northern Europe. Excuse me, boys. In 1634, the Swedish army was badly defeated, and the conflict became primarily political rather than religious. Alarmed by the growth of Habsburg's power, Cardinal Richelieu of France arranged an alliance between his country and the Swedish, German, and Dutch Protestants in 1635. The combined armies won several victories against the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg forces in a peace conference convened in Westphalia in western Germany to end the conflict. After several years of negotiation, the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648. 30 years of war had been waged over religion, only to end with the same religious situation that had existed before the war. Terms of the treaty included some of the following. The Protestant princes of Germany regained their lost territories, and the authority and ruler of each German territory retained the power to decide the official state religion for his domain. Calvinism required legal status in the Holy Roman Empire along with Romanism and Lutheranism. The Holy Roman Empire lost territory in the north to Sweden and in the south to France. Switzerland and the Netherlands were officially recognized as independent countries. France continued fighting with Spain for several more years and became the most powerful nation in the Holy Roman most powerful nation in Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor lost his power altogether, and the Habsburgs retained their power only in Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. The most significant and tragic outcome of the war, however, was that Germany was totally devastated. Over 8 million people, mostly Germans, died as a result of the fighting, disease, and famine caused by the war. while thousands of German cities, towns, and villages were destroyed. Germany was fragmented into over 300 separate little states that would remain in disunion for the next 2 centuries. With the power of the Pope and Emperor broken, Christendom became a land of religious and political diversity. For Tuesday, you are to do section 5 and section 4, section 4 and 5. Just the questions, all right? You may begin work now. Thank you for being with me today. You stay safe and stay blessed, and we'll see you on Tuesday. Bye-bye.